Hello there and welcome once again. This is Jennifer McGuire. Today I'm sharing several different techniques for creating color block cards. So basically the backgrounds of my cards have blocks of color and I'm really using bright bold colors today. But I wanted to show you a few different methods. I'm hoping that one of them will work well for you and that you'll give them a try. Now I'll do some more complicated ones to start with, but then show some simple variations later on and have lots of examples for you. So I'll tell you, I'm in a bit of a creative slump right now. I've just had a hard time coming up with ideas. So I looked at one of the things that I use for inspiration a lot, and that is my collection of enamel pins, something that I enjoy collecting. And I saw this pin right here that you see circled, and I decided to make some cards inspired by that. Well, while I was thinking about that, I thought, this look reminds me of a lot of the work that Laura Basson does. Laura's a good friend of mine. She creates the most beautiful, colorful backgrounds. Here's an example of her work here. If you've never seen her work, I will link here to her YouTube channel. I highly encourage checking her out. Okay, so let's jump into creating these cards. On most of my cards today, I use two new stamp sets from Simon Says Stamp. The first is the Good Job Mama stamp set. This is done by CZ Designs, Kathy Zilski. We actually work together on texting to come up with some of these sentiments. I've always wanted a stamp set that you could use to make encouragement cards for moms. Being a mom can be really hard sometimes, and I think to have these fun and encouraging and playful sentiments to encourage a fellow mother is really a useful set to have. A big thanks for Kathy for designing that set. I also will be using this beautiful Incredible Woman stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. There are wonderful sentiments in here for moms, grandmas, mums, aunts, and just for friends also. I'll be using some of the flower images and the small sentiments in this one. Okay, let's start with this card example here. This is my favorite way to do color blocking, and that is to cut up the background so you can ink each piece individually. I will be using an older Simon Says stamp that's called the Center Cut Kaleidoscope stamp. I like that you can take the center out and use the pieces separately or together. I'm going to use my MISTI stamping tool today just to make my stamping easy, but you could definitely just lay this stamp face up on your desk, ink it up, and then press your paper onto it to stamp instead. Now I wanted to make sure that I stamped this centered up on a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch piece of white cardstock. Here's a little trick. Since I really wanted to make sure this was centered, I take a piece of clear plastic. So any kind of clear packaging that you want to recycle, and I put it in the corner of my MISTI. I then ink up my stamp and stamp it onto that. I use VersaMark Ink here. You can't really see it in the video, but I can see it in real life. It leaves an impression on that paper. The reason I use VersaMark is that's what I'm going to use on my card, so I didn't want to have to clean off my stamp. So here's my piece of white cardstock that I want to center stamp on. I put a little temporary tape on the back of it. And now I'm going to slide it under that plastic. And I can see the pattern on the plastic. And I can see when it's centered on my white cardstock. Once I have it centered there, I can press my cardstock in place and remove that clear plastic. Now when I stamp this, it'll be perfectly centered on the cardstock. That's a little trick that I find very helpful, and I'll show you another option later on in this video. So now I'm inking up the stamp with VersaMark Ink and pressing firmly onto the cardstock. I will then add Hero Art's white embossing powder. And then after I heat up my heat gun for a little bit, I will bring that to my paper so that I can melt that embossing powder. So I have a white heat embossed image on white cardstock. You won't see it much, but you will once we add ink. So I trimmed my piece down to be 4 by 5 1/4. And now I'm cutting it right down the center, so I have 2 pieces that are 2 inches wide. I then am going to cut it in half the other direction too. So I'll end up with 4 pieces that are the same size. Basically, I'm cutting down the center in both directions. So now I have 4 different pieces that I can color block together. Now I decided I wanted to cut these again, so I end up with 8 pieces. So I'm just putting tape on the back of them to tape them together, to hold them together, which makes it easier to cut the additional times. This time I'm cutting from corner to corner in my trimmer. So I'm cutting diagonally across the card in one direction. Then after I do that, I will hold the pieces back together and cut it diagonal in the other direction, so from one corner to the other. So now I have 8 triangle pieces that I can ink up separately. Again, this is one way to do color blocking. I will show you some other examples later. Now for my inking, I'm using the Waffle Flower Water Media Matte. Now this is meant to do like watercolor on and different techniques like that. I don't do a whole lot of watercolor because I'm not great with it, but I know Christina Werner's used this, so you might want to check out her YouTube channel. I'm going to use this for inking today. That's what I like to use this mat for. This mat kind of holds onto your paper while you ink it, so you don't have to worry about putting your finger on it. So here I'm using my Picket Fence life-changing brushes. This is a great way to apply ink evenly. And I'm using Altenew inks. Any ink would work for this. And I'm trying to put the color heavier towards the inside tip of each piece. Once I've inked it, I can use a dry cloth to remove the excess color from the white heat embossed areas. So I'm using a bunch of different Altenew ink colors. I'll put them at the top of the screen here. I use these same colors throughout the whole video. You can see how easy it is to ink up the piece because it's staying still on this mat. And all that excess ink stays on the mat so I can pick it up and move it onto the paper. I can also dab excess off onto that. Now, if you do not have this mat, you could also use a piece of tape upside down so that the tape holds the paper in place while you do your inking. I'll do more examples of inking throughout this video. Now I'm assembling all of my little triangles together onto a piece of white cardstock. I want to have a backing to them so I can use it as a whole piece and add it to my card. You can see how these pieces fit back together nicely, and they're all perfectly inked separately. I find this really easy to do, and for me it's better than masking, but I'll show you that option too. Okay, so now I'm going to put liquid adhesive on the back of that and add a piece of craft foam. Then I'll use liquid adhesive again and add that onto a white note card. I wanted to keep this simple, so I die cut a circle and stamped a sentiment on it. And I also die cut a circle from craft foam to glue behind it to again give it some dimension. A die cut word would be fun on this too, but I really like that small sentiment at the center. Next, I put little dots of liquid adhesive to follow the pattern of the stamping in the background, and I added some white pearls to the pattern. I just thought it'd be fun to have a little bit of dimension there. I also chose a dull pink Simon Says stamp envelope to match. And here you can see the completed card. We get a beautiful color blocked background with the continuous stamped pattern across it. Now you could do masking for this card definitely, but I find that by cutting apart the different sections, I can get a clean inked look and I don't have to worry about messing up. Okay, let's do a similar card, but this time I'm using masking instead of cutting up the background, and I'm blending more color. I have a piece of 5 1/4 by 5 1/4 inch white cardstock, and I'm putting it into my MISTI. This time I'm using the Simon Says stamp center cut heart stamp. I centered the heart, then placed the rest of the stamp around it to make sure it's centered on my background. I could have done that in the last example, but not all background stamps have a center like this that will help you with centering. So if you have a solid background stamp where you want to center the pattern on your cardstock, follow the tip that I showed you in the last example. Okay, I use my anti-static powder tool. Now I'm inking up with VersaMark Ink. Press that firmly onto my cardstock. Add white embossing powder and then heat set it. So I have a square piece here where our pattern is centered and we have white heat embossing on white cardstock. I then stamped this same image with some light gray ink onto scrap cardstock. And I'm cutting the heart out from the center. This will be a mask at the center of our card that follows the pattern of stamping. So you can see it there. Now I'm going to do inking over this. Instead of cutting it up, we're going to mask. So I have a piece of masking tape here, and I'm stretching it to connect one corner with the other corner. Then I will do the same with the other two corners. So I have that triangle area at the top where I can apply inks. Instead of masking into 8 sections, I'm only doing 4 sections this time, but applying 2 colors of ink to each section. So here I'm blending some pink over to the left, and then I'll blend some orange over to the right and meet them up in the middle. I really like using these life-changing brushes with my dye inks because I can get light control or dark control of the color. So you can really control how much ink you're putting down. And I can overlap in the middle so I get a nice blended look. However, if you have other ink blending tools, you can definitely use those instead. After I'm done with that, I wipe my tape clean so that I can reuse these pieces multiple times. And then I'm connecting the corners to mask off the next area. This time I'm using yellow and green, and you can see how I make sure they overlap quite a bit in the middle to get a nice, complete blended look. Each time you also want to make sure you use a dry cloth to wipe off the excess ink from your white heat embossing so that it stays nice and crisp. So you could have done masking with the last example that we did instead of cutting up the background. I encourage you to try both and figure out which works better for you. I tend to sometimes be messy with masking. That's why I feel a little safer by cutting up the pieces and inking each up separately. However, if you are good at masking, you can definitely do this technique for either of these cards. Now, I was going to stamp directly into that white opening at the center, but decided I wanted to instead have some dimension. So I used the Simon Says stamp Deco Heart die. That heart die lines up perfectly with this stamp. They go together nicely. So I die cut it from white cardstock, and I'm using the negative space to help me line up and stamp my sentiment perfectly onto the heart die cut. This is a trick I've been doing a lot lately, and I find I get better results than when I stamp and then die cut. This way I can make sure it's straight and looks great before stamping on the die cut. I also use the die to cut from white craft foam, and I'll glue that to the back of our stamped die cut so that it has some nice even raised dimension on our card. So I glued my inked background onto a 5.5 by 5.5 inch white note card that I created, and I'll use a 6-inch envelope for this. I then added my heart to the center, but decided I wanted another sentiment on that heart. So I peeled it off before my adhesive dried, and I'm adding a little sentiment from the Great Job Mama stamp set right underneath it. And I really like the look of that. I like how those all go together nicely. So I applied more glue and I'm adding it in place. I change my mind a lot and make changes like that. So don't be afraid to, make any changes you want to a card to get it just right. I also added some pearls to the background, and there you can see the color block look that we get using masking. Okay, my next example actually only has 2 color block areas with a mask section right at the middle. This would be great for a 1-layer card if you wanted. I'm starting with a piece of white cardstock that's 5.25 by 4 inches, and I'm putting tape along at a diagonal. I just thought that would be fun. I'm going to start by doing stamping above this tape. I used my anti-static powder tool, and now I'm using some of the flowers from the Incredible Woman stamp set that I showed you earlier. I'm stamping them with VersaMark ink, and then I will white heat emboss. I'm doing my stamping right along that masked edge. So what will happen is when we make this card, it looks like the white flowers are coming out from the white masked area of our card. So I added my embossing powder and heat set it. You can see a couple flowers there. I then created masks for each of these little flowers that I'm stamping. This is using Inkadinka-Doo masking paper. And I lined them up over my stamping on my card. That way I can overlap all my stamping and not get a muddied look. So now I'm stamping another one of the flower images, again with VersaMark ink. And then we will add the white embossing powder, remove our little flower masks, and heat set again. So you could do a border stamp here if you wanted to save some time. But I really like the style of these flowers, and I thought they would look good clustered together above and below our little masked area. So we're just starting out with the area above it right now. So there you can see how my flowers are starting to form to fill in that area. Okay, so I continue to add my stamping. I'm freezing it here so you can see it. So I have like a border of white heat embossing. Now, without removing my mask, I'm applying ink to the top section of our card. This is the Lagoon color, and I'm applying it very heavy towards the mask and then lighter towards the top edge of the card to kind of give an ombre look. So usually I start by inking up my brush, bringing it to the area I want to be darkest, and then slowly blending out to the lighter area. After wiping away the excess ink, I can carefully remove my masking tape. And now we need to mask off the bottom portion. So here's a trick I do. I use one piece of tape to mask where I want the white to be. So you see that white gap in the middle? Now I take another piece of tape, which are all being reused over and over, lining it up with that so it's edge to edge with that first piece of tape. And then I can remove the first piece of tape. So behind that mask is that perfect thin white area where we will add our sentiment later. So I'm flipping this over and doing the exact same thing I did before. I'm doing white heat embossing right along the edge of that mask. Once I've done all of that masking, I applied some blue Altenew ink, again very heavy over the stamping and at the edge of the mask, and then I lightened it up towards the edge of the cardstock. After wiping off the excess ink, I can remove the mask, and I stamped a sentiment from that Simon Says Stamp Incredible Woman stamp set right into that opening. I added that to a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white note card, and then added some little pearls as accents. Again, this would be a great option for a 1-layer card if you wanted, but I decided to add a little dimension to it. And to match up with that, I have a Simon Says Stamp metallic silver envelope. I think it really finishes off a card nicely to have an envelope that matches. Okay, my next example is a different type of color block design, and in this case, we have a white gap between the pieces. For this, I used the Simon Says Stamp Delicate Flowers stamp set. These detailed thin line flowers are really beautiful, as are the different sentiments in it. I've arranged a bunch of the flower and leaf images in my MISTI stamping tool, and I have a piece of white cardstock that is 4 by 5 1/4. Now I am going to stamp all of these flowers with VersaMark ink onto the white cardstock, and then add my white heat embossing powder, and then I'll heat set it. I started with white embossing powder for all of my examples because I like it with the bright color around it. That contrast is fun, but you could do something more subtle if you wanted to. Now here I'm cutting this paper randomly. You can cut it however you want. I cut it about 1 inch from one edge. Then I cut about 1 inch from the edge of that piece, and then about 1 inch from the edge of this. So I end up with 4 random size pieces that will all piece together nicely on my card. So let me reassemble them here so you can see what they look like. I just randomly cut them, kind of fun. Well, I wanted to cut a gap between them. So what I did is I taped my pieces back together. So the 2 halves I taped back together. The tape is on the back of the piece. Now I'm going to cut a little bit off the inside edge of both of those. That way there will be a gap between the pieces, but the pattern will continue. You could just cut them apart and then spread them, but then your flower looks disjointed or your background pattern looks disjointed. This will give you a continuous pattern because you're actually cutting out a section. So now I'm cutting a little bit off this bottom piece, and then I'll do that to the other. That way we're cutting little gaps between each piece. Now it may be confusing here as to what I'm doing, but when the card is colored, you'll be able to see why I did this, so just stick with me. Okay, now I decided to flip it over, and this is how I'll have my card arranged. But I wanted a bigger gap in that top section so I could stamp a sentiment there. So I'm going and just trimming a little bit off the top of this big piece and the bottom of that top piece so that I have room to stamp a sentiment there. So I'll trim a little bit more off here, and now we have our pieces ready to go. Takes a little bit of prep work to get that just right, but I think it's worth it in the end. So now I am applying my inks just as I have many times in this video. And again, I decided to blend 2 colors together, so you just want to make sure that you overlap them in the center. I did that to all of my pieces, And then I glued them onto my card, arranged how we had planned with our cutting. Now notice those flowers and leaves. They're continuous. They aren't like spread apart. They look like continuous flowers where we just cut little sections out. I also added a stamp sentiment from the Good Job Mama stamp set. And I added a few pearls too. So this shows how you can do color blocking, but with little gaps between. Now here's another color block card. I just wanted to use those stamp sets again, so I just threw this one in. I started by white heat embossing that cluster of flowers from the Simon Says Stamp Delicate Flower stamp set. I did that on a piece of cardstock that is 4 inches by 5 1/4. I decided to cut this up instead of masking, so I cut it right down the center, and then I cut it again about 2 inches from the top, so I end up with 4 pieces. You could definitely mask if you feel more comfortable doing that. I just happen to be better with cutting up the pieces. Now I'm adding ink to each of the pieces, being sure to buff off the excess once I'm done inking, and then we can reassemble those together. I thought it would be fun to first add something inside of that stamping. So instead of coloring it in, I'm using my Aqua Shimmer pen to add shimmer inside of the stamping. And you'll be able to see this when we tilt it in the light, but it just adds some interest to the simple card. Now I have a piece of cardstock that I've put adhesive on so I can piece all of my background pieces together. Then I have that one solid piece that I can add onto my card. I put white craft foam behind it once again so I could have some nice dimension, and added it to a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white note card. I then die cut a white heart and stamped Hello Friend from the Simon Says Stamp Delicate Flower stamp set and added that right in the center. I also added some pearls around it. You can see the shimmer inside of that stamping, which really catches the nice light nicely as I tilt it here, and how we have that bold color blocked background. I went for bright colors on all of my examples today, but keep in mind you can do these techniques with any colors. And as you can see, you can use background stamps, outline stamps, solid stamps, whatever you have. Okay, I have one more example, and I'm not going to show you all of it since I'm running out of time here, but I just wanted to show it to you quickly. In this case, I masked off lines of color. And in those areas, I have white heat embossed sentiments. I also have some subtle flowers in the background, if you can see it here. I started by white heat embossing those sentiments onto white cardstock using my MISTI stamping tool. You can see I actually drew pencil lines to help me get them spaced evenly, but you could wing it if you wanted to. So I stamped that with VersaMark ink, and then I added white embossing powder and heat set it. Once I had that embossing done, I wanted to stamp some flowers in the background, but I wanted it to be super, super subtle. So here's the trick that I did. If you stamp with VersaMark ink on a background and then apply color over it, the VersaMark ink somewhat resists it even if you don't heat emboss it. So I stamped those flowers with VersaMark ink right on top of our white heat embossed sentiments, and then I heat set it. Now I'm using masking with masking tape to mask off lines or different sections and applying color over it, and I'm applying the color very heavily. Once I've filled in that section with color, I can wipe away the excess, move my tape, and then ink up another area. And I just end up with a stripe background. Now, when I stamped all those flowers with VersaMark ink, and then I just heat set it, it basically resists some of the color we're putting on top. You see those subtle flowers in the background? It's super subtle. If I wanted them to be more intense, there are many other techniques I could do, but I just wanted subtle flowers in the background. I've done this technique before in videos, and I'll link to it here if you want to learn more about it. So I continued to do this until my entire white cardstock was covered with color. I added that on to a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch note card, but I did it kind of sideways just for a fun diagonal look. So it doesn't really look it, but this is one continuous piece here between all of those colors. I just did that with masking. You definitely could cut up a background and do this look, but I thought in this case that masking would look better. So I hope this inspires you to try different types of color blocking. It's a great technique that you can do with many different inks and many different stamps. So give it a try. I will link all of my supplies below in my YouTube description if you're interested. I also have it listed on my blog. I appreciate the time that you spent with me here today. If you want, there's a couple other videos that you might like, including one that is similar to that last card we made. Thanks for stopping by. We'll see you soon and take care.